Today we're going to discuss something super interesting and something that most of us probably had no idea even existed. And it's something to do with static electricity, the phenomenon that basically causes this. It makes cats super miserable. Or the phenomenon that once in a while zaps you if you rub just the right body part if you're wearing certain types of clothes. But for us, for people, and I guess cats in this case, normally static is just a kind of a nuisance and something that we generally only worry about if, for example, working with electronics, because in some cases it can damage electronics if, for example, you're working in some kind of a repair shop and are working with electronic devices. But turns out that this is not the case for a lot of tiny animals. Because as you're going to find out from this video, when it comes to tiny life, for many of them static electricity is a fundamental tool for survival, travel, hunting, and actually a lot of other things. Something that we didn't even know about up until relatively recently. And because of this, in the last few years, there's now been this new field of science. It's actually referred to as electrostatic ecology, an emerging field that's revealing to us that Earth's natural electric fields may be super important for a lot of different animals and just as important as the food they eat and the air they breathe. In other words, what's nuisance to us seems to be absolutely crucial for a lot of different life out there. And so, hello wonderful person, this is Anton. In this video we're going to focus on some of the recent discoveries when it comes to the static electricity and animal life, and mostly focusing on these two recent studies that actually discovered something completely new about certain types of worms. Something that you're sort of witnessing right here. And so let's talk about these discoveries in a bit more detail, but as always you can find all of the links in the description below. But I guess let's start with some of the basics and some of the previous discoveries we've already known about based on years and years of research. And so here we have to shrink down from human scale, where static electricity usually produces some kind of a tiny shock, and focus on animals that are just a few millimeters long, where the world works entirely differently. And so over the last few years, researchers discovered that quite a few of these tiny animals seem to directly rely on static electricity for some really important stuff. For example, we know that bees and butterflies usually accumulate a lot of positive static charge during flight, whereas flowers usually produce negative charge and are also grounded. And as a result, when a bee or some kind of a butterfly comes really close to a flower, this difference in charge causes a lot of pollen to literally jump into the insect and get stuck to their body. But when this insect approaches a different flower, due to differences in charge, the pollen then jumps again and lands on the next flower, literally making pollination far more efficient and basically making pollination even possible. Because if it wasn't for the static electricity, it's extremely unlikely that most of this pollen would be able to propagate. But a much more interesting example is from the realm of spiders. Here, a lot of species, especially tiny ones, very often use the process referred to as ballooning. A process that was officially described back in 2018. And this is when a spider starts to release silk threads that at first seem to have no particular purpose. Essentially here they're just releasing threads into the open air. But when the scientists film this, watch what actually happens. Turns out that they're doing this on purpose. Because of this they literally start flying. And so yeah, in case you were not aware, spiders can fly. And though at first this was believed to be just a result of wind, apparently they do this even when there is no wind because all of this seems to work through atmospheric electric fields that provide enough forces to lift the spiders and propel them for extremely long distances, sometimes hundreds of kilometers. And so quite a few spiders have developed this bizarre strategy that allows them to move from one place to another, with all of this basically being almost entirely electrostatic in nature. But some of the smaller spiders, and specifically some of the ticks, especially this one known as Electrosensation, developed a very similar strategy where they're actually able to cross very large air gaps and jump onto various mammals, birds, or reptiles just because of static electricity that usually builds up on the host fur as it moves through vegetation. And so here, electrostatic attraction allows these ticks to cross very large distances and dramatically increases its chance to attach to a host and then to feed. This was only discovered back in 2023 and described in the study right here. But more recently, we've also discussed the idea behind electrosensation, and specifically certain animals, such as caterpillars and certain beetles, can use this electrostatic ecology to acquire a kind of a sixth sense. And so here they can use body hairs and posture to directly interact with ambient electric fields and to then sense different types of threats and different types of predators. For example, for caterpillars and for certain beetles, they're able to sense the charge from certain types of wasps that tend to be relatively dangerous to their species. And so quite a few of them use this to their benefit in order to improve predator evasion. And quite a few insects, including bees, seem to actually sense the static field around themselves, allowing them to discover certain types of flowers that might contain better nectar. In other words, here static electricity is officially recognized as an ecological factor. It plays a very important role for a lot of different animals and for a lot of different reasons. But today I wanted to focus on some of the more surprising discoveries coming from the kingdom of worms. Discoveries involving even smaller animals, and some of the most famous worms in science referred to as nematodes, also known as tiny roundworms. The famous C. elegans. This is of course one of the most studied organisms on the entire planet, but it was only recently that scientists discovered the effect from static electricity on these worms. Now these worms are really small, only approximately 1 millimeter across, and overall they're pretty simple as well. And so a few years back, some scientists discovered that some of them were actually clinging to the lids of plastic petri dishes, and it wasn't entirely clear how they got there. Now normally you would assume that they basically crawled up there. I mean, they are worms after all, but that's not what scientists discovered when they tried to conduct high-speed camera observations. These worms were actually jumping there. And so in one of the studies, Japanese researchers discovered that these worms used a specific posture called nictation to stand on their tails and to basically reduce the surface area touching the ground. This is not something scientists have seen before. And then from this position, if there was some kind of an electric field, they were then literally pulled up and cross the air at speeds up to about 1 meter per second. And though at first researchers thought that maybe this is some kind of an accident, and maybe this just happens to some worms, they then tested this with bumblebees. And they found that bees that naturally have a positive charge created electric fields strong enough to almost always pull these worms onto their backs. But moreover, worms were not doing this by accident, they did this on purpose. As a matter of fact, some of them even built very large towers. We've actually talked about this in one of the previous videos in the description, where they formed these nictation columns with 80 to 100 worms stacking on top of each other, and some of them eventually escaping when the insect passed by. As a matter of fact, in many cases it wasn't just 1 or 2 worms, it was most of them. And all of this was once again the result of static. Once the worm found itself somewhere else, it would detach and start its life elsewhere. And so because this was such an exciting discovery, researchers wanted to see if other worms use this for other reasons. And the answer is of course yes. So this is the most recent study from 2025 that once again discovers an extremely similar strategy, but this time for a much more malicious purpose. And so this time they found a different species of nematode referred to as Steinernema carpocapsae that seems to use the exactly same strategy, but this time for hunting. These are parasitic worms that seem to kill insects for food. And so let's discuss this new discovery about these scary guys. And so here researchers from the Emory University and UC Berkeley decided to focus on how exactly these worms seem to hunt, and why in some cases they tend to coil their bodies, and how they're usually able to cross very large distances up to 25 times their body length. That's basically kind of like a human being jumping over a 10-story building. But the thing is, we know that for these insects, jumping can be risky. If this worm misses the target, it might land somewhere very dangerous and eventually die. But somehow they were able to do so very effectively almost every time. Which is why researchers wanted to analyze this and once again film them using high-speed cameras. And so here, by tracking these worms as they leaped on various fruit flies, they once again discovered the same phenomenon. Because the fruit flies are positive and the worms are negative, this produces electrostatic induction. And it basically creates an attractive force that almost always pulls the worm toward the fly. And so here data showed that approximately 80% of all jumps were successful. Yet when scientists calculated what would happen if there was no static, they discovered that only 5% would be successful, and worms would usually miss if there was no electricity. And so without this electrostatic boost, this jumping behavior would probably not even evolve, because it would just be too inefficient. And so it only works because of the electrostatic induction. Intriguingly, in this case, it actually involves charges of approximately 800 volts, which is apparently not uncommon for a lot of different insects, because as they beat their wings and as they rub against the air, they do produce a lot of positive charge. Okay, so these are obviously really cool discoveries, but does it have any practical use for us right here in our macro world? Well, the answer is probably yes. and mostly when it comes to various types of pest controls, and especially when it comes to these parasites. For example, by understanding the electrical relationship between the parasite and the host, we can actually use this to improve different types of agriculture, because in some cases these insects can either benefit certain types of plants or can produce problems for certain types of crops. And so here, by using parasitic worms and by using static electricity, we could maybe find a way to control this relationship. On top of this also actually solves the mystery of why sometimes a lot of these tiny worms or these nematodes have even been found flying in the air. And this is actually related to a concept referred to as aeroplankton, kind of like the sea plankton, but in this case in the air and not in the ocean. Basically here, the wind itself usually carries a lot of tiny life forms that can then be spread across different regions. And we know that even upper atmosphere seems to contain a lot of these nematodes just flying across the skies. And while it's never really been clear exactly how they're able to do this, but it might be, once again, because of these electrostatic forces. Basically here it's quite possible that many different organisms use static electricity in the air to then hitch rides on different raindrops and dust particles, allowing them to spread across the entire planet. But because this is a relatively recent discovery, right now we're just starting to map this electrostatic world, and we only started to discover these animals in the last 5 years. But as our technology improves, and as we discover more of these animals, we're probably going to discover even more bizarre mysteries about this very strange electric world and how it affects various animals around us. And so until future discoveries, or until we learn something else, that's all I wanted to mention. Check out some of the previous videos in the description. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.